name is David Bailey. I'm Director of Research at Carmel College, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about this idea of leading with engagement. And what I'd like to do is to start this session by asking you to look at some images. So 2 questions. What are these images, and what do they all have in common? So if you were thinking they're perhaps all something to eat and drink, you're on the right lines, but there's a deeper connection. So just look closely and think for a moment to see if you can spot the connection. Okay, we'll come back to those a little later, but for now I just want to talk to you a little more about 1 or 2 other things. I suppose I wanted to start by thinking about why we were thinking about the start of lessons. And it isn't just education where the start matters. For example, in the music industry, the intro length, the moment from when the music starts to when the first word in the song is sung, has changed significantly over recent decades. So if you look at U2's Where the Streets Have No Names, that intro was 118 seconds. It was indeed 2 minutes before Bono uttered his first words. Sam Smith's Too Good to Say Goodbyes in 2017 had an intro of just 1 second. And the reason that's been suggested behind this is it's all about streaming services, and it's much easier to change your mind or click between sounds and tracks. Whereas if you'd invested the time into putting an LP onto your record player, you probably wouldn't be so keen to change the tracks quite so quickly. Another example is YouTube, which changed social streaming pretty radically, versus TikTok. And if you look at the average YouTube trending video, it's about 4.5 minutes long. TikTok videos are much, much shorter. They're of the order of seconds, up to a minute if you string 4 of them together. And it's not just those media as well. So if you think about the classic elevator pitch in business, the idea that you could succinctly describe a successful idea to somebody who's very busy but has the ability to make your idea happen. And an elevator pitch is the length of time that you'd have stood next to them in an elevator, or as we say over here, a lift, about 30 seconds to get your idea across. So all of those things are about competing for our attention. Now, there's been some suggestions recently that human attention span is less than that of a goldfish, which is apparently about 9 seconds, although I'm not sure how they measure that. However, although it's likely to be declining, this is likely to be a typical internet exaggeration and much more likely to last at least a few minutes for most children in an educational context. On a positive note, we do have the ability to refocus attention on something, so focusing for an hour is possible if something keeps grabbing your attention. It also increases until about your mid-40s. What was I saying? So, when we're talking about starting a lesson, we're presented with some choices. In the work that I do with schools, I've found lots of different examples of different choices that teachers have made. Now, you can start a lesson with lesson objectives, retrieval practice, engaging starters, mysteries or big questions, or what's in it for me? Or you could just start. Now, interestingly, this is actually the subject of an EEF trial, the idea of teacher choices, where the start of the lesson is one of the things they're looking into. So perhaps it does matter. So perhaps we're going to start working backwards. So let's work in reverse. With perhaps the biggest question, why don't we just start a lesson? After all, you might spend at least 5 minutes doing some form of start to the lesson. Why not just get on with it? The time over the year would certainly add up, especially if you find yourselves in a position where you have to cram a lot of learning into a very short time frame, something that's in people's minds at the moment. For some, particularly where there's ongoing work, project work, that is indeed the case as they use this approach, and some would argue successfully. It's true to say, though, for the majority, it's not fashionable. Therefore, we don't do it. It's also true to say a start helps establish a routine. A start helps focus learning to highlight some of the purpose of the learning, the rationale behind it, and can help some groups of pupils, in particular, those who like or have an expected structure. So in short, sacrificing a few minutes for a good start to a lesson is probably better and more than pays for itself in terms of the time taken. So this quote, you can still hopefully see on screen at the moment, is once often attributed to Aristotle. And it may well have its origins there, but the quote as it stands on the screen is actually much closer to home. It was quoted in 1908 in the Hartlepool Northern Daily Mail, and it was about a preacher in the Durham area talking about the 3 parts of a sermon. And when you understand the roots of this idea and its association with perhaps didactic teaching, it goes some way to explaining why this might have fallen out of fashion. Although the national strategies did help establish this as standard practice. So the idea that starting with lesson objectives may be not quite so fashionable at the moment, but these ideas are drawn from educational research, and pretty sound research at that. The work that was done here underpinned what happened in the national strategy. And specifically in core subjects and in primaries, it was spread quite widely, so lots of teachers adopted this approach. Core to this idea is this idea of sharing success with pupils, which the evidence suggested would help them to learn better. The question I'd ask is, does it have to be the first thing that we do? There are some problems that result from learning objectives. So, for example, in a number of schools, they took to asking the pupils to write down all of the learning outcomes, spending maybe 5 or more minutes starting every lesson by writing these things down. Now just imagine transferring that back across to YouTube, watching a YouTube video where the first thing they do is tell you what's in the video and ask you to write those things down. Speaking of learning objectives, I nearly forgot. So what I've done is I've put up some learning outcomes for this session. If you want to write them down, you can, but not really, because that will be almost certainly a complete waste of your valuable time. It is perhaps worth a read, though, as it helps understand the thought process around this session. But please note, this wasn't the first thing that I did. Let's look at the third alternative from that choice I gave you before, the idea of an engaging starter. Now, on the face of it, an engaging starter might sound like a good idea. Often uses visual imagery, but often other imagery can be used as well. It can be really effective, and if used with good questioning, like for example in the picture here, why is the sign there? To which the simple answer might be, because the people have a dog. But how do you know what kind of dog is it? How do you know for sure that they have a dog? Why else might they put the sign there? That can really help engage. But there are a couple of issues with that. The lesson needs to deliver. If the only engaging part is the start to the lesson, people soon work that out. And pretty quickly, the idea of the engaging starter becomes much less engaging over time. And there's a risk of habituation through overuse. You get too many warning signs, and after a while you stop paying attention to them. So there's not so much wow about it after all. So let's have a look at an idea of an engaging start from another walk of life. Now, thinking about the way in which the newspaper articles are laid out, you have the headline to draw your attention, and then the first few lines you have some really attention-grabbing information. And then as you read through the article, hopefully you're hooked in and you can read the level of detail. Now, this same format is shared by online news websites too, and it's been shown over years to be really good at selling the news, a really effective way to do so. By the way, I had to do with a stock image of a newspaper. I couldn't get a hold of a real one, at least not without spending about 10 minutes disinfecting it. And apparently at the start of the lockdown, there was a roaring black market trade in old newspapers, but I can't think why. So the fourth one we'll look at is retrieval practice. And with retrieval practice, this is perhaps the most fashionable at the moment. Again, it's based on sound evidence, and it seems to help lots of learners. It tends to be used a lot in some schools. Can be brilliant. However, just be cautious, because if a child's experiencing this at the start of every lesson, it can be quite repetitive, and it can often be set at too low a level, and spending all of that time on factual recall and perhaps not enough time on taking that information a bit further. Just for the record, though, I am a bit of a fan of retrieval practice, just not always the way I see that it's carried out. I have the good fortune to be able to talk to lots of pupils, and I get to hear what they say. And I hear all of these different things, that the start of a lesson makes a difference. The right start reduces pupil misbehaviour, increases participation, helps things run more smoothly. According to pupils, lessons start to follow fashions and trends. This idea that lesson objectives were replaced by engaging starters, which is now being replaced by retrieval practice. And regardless of the trend, the vast majority of lessons in a particular school start on trend. So whatever the fashion is in that school, well, most of the lessons tend to do that. And there tends to be little variety. They recognise that not all starts have the same value. And people really appreciate being engaged. Now, at the start of this, there were 6 choices that I outlined. I'm going to go back and question a little bit about that assumption. Okay, but before we do that, I just want to have a look at this kind of timeline that's emerged. Back when I was at school, just start was the most common way to do things, and this kind of followed a pattern. But let's have a look at that idea of a choice. Question is, do you always have to choose? Let's say you had to choose between sweet or savoury, and you're only ever allowed either sweet or savoury. Which would you pick? Well, once upon a time you did. You chose between the two. And that was until, in the 1990s, this idea of salted caramel, the salted caramel macaron, was invented. Back to the questions I left you at the start. Now, if you haven't already worked it out, let's perhaps give you some names to help you a little bit, just thinking about what the deeper connection is between these things. We've got strawberries and balsamic vinegar, salted caramel cheesecake, chili and chocolate, and of course, gin and tonic. Now, all 4 of those have 2 distinct flavours in them, and you can combine them in such a way that you end up with something really quite pleasant if you get it right. But in both cases, one of those flavours could completely overwhelm the other. If you got too much of one, it just wouldn't be palatable. So what I'd like to do is think about this idea of a choice not being a binary choice. It's something that actually you can look at a combination. And there's 2 more we haven't looked at at all at this point, so I just need to introduce those quickly. So then there's the idea of mysteries, or big questions, or the big question. And I've got an example of some different mysteries from different subject areas to try and give you something that you can think a little bit about. Now, the advantage of a mystery is that you can use that to engage, particularly if you add in some imagery, but you can also go much more deeply with it. So the idea of thinking about why was Stonehenge built. But crucially, you can also use it to help find out what pupils already know. So you can do it as a form of retrieval practice. So what do we mean by stone? What else could they have built Stonehenge out of? Why did they build things out of stone? And for the synonyms question at the end, what is a synonym? What does the word superfluous mean? What are the synonyms for superfluous? How many can we find? And then what do you notice about that question? You can also change the imagery a little bit as well to match that and engage further. Now, the final element is the what's in it for me. And this final element is not just for the start, although it can be involved at the start. It is something that you can draw on throughout the lesson. And these are ideas that help build cultural capital. And that's really crucial for those children who don't necessarily get that from home. The ideas of linking with other subjects. So this linking to careers and linking to further study in later life, they will find this stuff useful because not so much wow as Now, drawing your attention back to the title of the presentation, this is leading with engagement. And the idea is to not just do what we call superficial engagement and just use hooks or engaging hooks, but to take those in through discussion and find out what the children already know, putting in that retrieval practice and actually taking those things deeper and deeper until there's a kind of deeper engagement with what's happening. So it isn't just the hook. This is about going further and beyond and much, much deeper. It's much more of a recipe. And I suppose the key thing of a recipe like this is getting the mix is crucial. It's not an easy skill, but with a bit of practice, you can get really, really good at this kind of thing. That imagery is important. So is retrieval practice, but you don't have to have them separately. By adding a dash of mystery as well, you can take things deeper and, crucially, a slice of what's in it for me. Now, hopefully, unlike the mocktails and cocktails you might be making at home, you probably won't have to substitute any of these ingredients because these are things that teachers have in ready supply. Now, speaking of which, in the current climate, how relevant is all this? It's really hard to try and think about some of these things when it seems like all you're doing is getting through the day. Now, I'd argue that this perhaps is more important than ever because children and parents need all the help they can get in order to engage with the learning. And they've probably got more distractions than they've ever had that are competing for that short little span of attention. So in summary, there are some things to think about. Leading an engagement is not a choice, but a combination about bringing retrieval practice and engagement together and incorporating that kind of retrieval into the engagement and going beyond the superficial and bringing yourself back to a hook that actually takes you deeper, framing a question that you can think about. Now, crucially, the use of really good questions will allow you to make the most out of every opportunity. Hopefully you've had a chance to think a little bit about something there. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.